My name's Todd O'Hair, and I'm the president and CEO of the Montana Chamber of Commerce. And we are doing our session wrap up after we've kind of had a chance to catch our breath and look back and reflect on what happened and what didn't happen. And we're going to spend a little bit of time too as we look ahead. So it's not too early to start thinking about 2025, although it feels like it should be. It's actually not too early. And so we wanted to bring in a few other folks here to help us kind of digest and take apart a little bit of the wins and the opportunities that may have been missed during the session, maybe some of the threats that we were able to dodge. And so we're thrilled to have Aimee Grmoljez. She's sitting to my left here. Aimee's a partner at the Crowley Fleck law firm, and she served on the Montana Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and on the foundation board for 10 years. And she was the chair of the board just before I took over as chair of the board.
Right.
So Aimee has a great history with the Montana Chamber of Commerce and the various sort of activities we've had during different sort of legislative sessions. And I think importantly for this discussion is that Aimee has a big, wide, diverse set of clients that represent the broad spectrum of Montana's economy that had a lot of issues here as well. Then Steve Wade, who's sitting just opposite of me, is a partner at Browning Kalecyzc Berry Hoven. We typically shorten that up to BKBH. It's one of the premier law firms in the state. And Steve was on contract with us leading up to this session and through the session to assist us with our lobbying efforts. And Steve has been working with us for a number of legislative sessions as we continue to grow our footprint in the legislative session. And then of course, Charles Robison, our government affairs director, sitting directly across from me. And so we're recording this piece of it. And then when we get done with kind of our dialogue and conversation about this legislative session, we'll stop the recording and then we'll open it up for any questions and answers that any of you might have or comments that you want to provide. But you can do that after we stop the recording so you don't have to worry about being caught in forever perpetuity for something that you may have asked. And so with that, I'm just going to ask the three of them, and any one of the three of you can kind of jump in, or all of you can jump in. As we look back on this legislative session, we saw super majorities in the Republican legislature. There were various factions within the Republican caucus. But overall, how do you feel like the overall tenor of this legislative session went?
You want to go first?
Well, there was a moment of silence.
Yeah. Who wants to poke their stick in that one?
Okay, I'll go first. You know, I think that the overall tenor was positive for business. I think the chamber has done a really terrific job of putting their legislative priorities out. And I mean, without fail, they were all successful and they were all focused on business issues. They very much aligned with the governor's priorities as it related to taxation issues that were front and center for his administration well in advance. I would say, in my opinion, supermajorities are really difficult. Yeah. It doesn't matter who's in charge, Republican or Democrat. And I think that speakers of the House who've had to deal with those, and now the first president of the Senate would probably agree with that statement. So, you know, for those of us in this room, we've all been here longer than the term limited folks. And so I think we kind of have a little bit of that 2020 vision to think about, you know, the ability to work on budgetary issues before showing up to the legislature with the governor. And I think that there was some of that occurred, but I think there were also maybe some folks in the legislative branch that were flexing their muscle, so to speak, a little bit on some of those changes to the governor's budget and things that happened in the course of that. So those would be kind of some, I guess, overall comments that I would offer about it. The ending was a little unusual. Day 87 having a sine die motion by the minority leader in the Senate with 10 Republicans joining. Some of them who had conference committee bills still sitting out there that died, that weren't happy about that. But, you know, that's what happens when you vote for the sine die motion. So I thought that was a little unique and unusual. And I think there was a little bit of end of session communication, maybe, I don't know the best way to say it, I guess.
Could have been better.
Could have been a little better, recognizing that the minority in the House didn't know the minority in the Senate was going to do that. And of course, the majorities also maybe not all being on the same page. So I'd say that overall, those are just some general comments. I don't know, Steve, if you agree with that, or you always have something more judicious to say.
No, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think going into the session, there was a lot of folks had different kind of preconceived notions of what supermajority meant. But I think overall, when you look back on it from a kind of a pro-business perspective, it turned out to be a very good legislative session when you think about not only the regulatory reform kind of aspects on some of those key issues, but also the tax kind of impacts as well. You know, those were good things. I mean, and all of that happened really when a lot of the majority of the news was related to kind of the social issues. So that didn't get picked up a whole lot. So I think the chamber's kind of key agenda and all of those bills got through, and it was very successful, but without a whole lot of fanfare.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, and I think it wasn't really a surprise, I think, to most of us, but there was a lot of press about constitutional referendums and amendments. I don't think most of us thought many of those would actually get through. And as it turned out, none of them did. And so I think that probably was predictable as well, that a lot of people spent a lot of time, I think, worrying about those things being passed. But overall, I think it was, it was an interesting session when you had a lot of issues out there that were kind of sucking the air out of the room, but a lot of important work was being done on the side in some of the main policy issues.
So some of the social issue flashpoints may have sucked some of the attention away from some of the really good stuff that was happening on the business front. I think what you're suggesting is that the business community in Montana really came out of the session in pretty good shape.
Yeah, on those issues, I don't want to say some of those other issues don't over kind of lay into some of the business kind of communities, but on the core kind of chamber issues, I mean, those things if you just look at the list of what our core agenda going into the session were, I mean, hugely successful. And I mean, the agenda that Charles and you put together, I mean, it turned out to be, a great game plan, and it was successful. And it was, almost all but one bill got through.
Yeah.
And then a few were added on, and then you also had a lot of people bring other bills and then ask for chamber support that ended up getting passed. So I thought it turned out to be a really successful session.
Charles, let's talk about that for a second. You quarterbacked, I think, an unprecedented effort by the Montana Chamber of Commerce to bring forward a package of bills that sought to improve the overall business climate in Montana. Yeah. Primarily targeted at tort reform, right? Yeah. Those efforts to lower the risk of litigation to businesses, lower the time frame that businesses that happen to be in litigation may be in litigation, provide some overall certainty. And so talk a little bit about like those big bills that we ushered through and what the success rate ended up being.
Well, and thanks, Todd. I want to say before I respond to that there was a lot of groundwork laid before I showed up at the chamber, and Aimee and Steve were both involved with our Justice Coalition, and Bridger Malum, who was in this job before me, did a lot of work getting things ready. But yeah, a lot of groundwork laid, and we built on that, getting into the fall. And on the tort reform issues, the idea there being, let's ensure that Montanans get a fair shake in the courtroom, and that we get reasonable and reasonably fast settlements when people are injured. But let's not just have courtrooms just be used to generate revenue for lawyers and others, and that really takes away from, costs everybody else more money and doesn't necessarily get people get people compensated and made whole when as much when they're injured. So that was our focus to move things along on the lawsuit front, and we saw there's been a problem that really driving up insurance costs in Montana related to this unique court-created claim of third-party common law bad faith claims that really get in the way of speedy settlement of insurance claims. And we had attorneys from the plaintiffs bar that talked to the legislature even about how these abusive practices is a small subset of lawyers, but we heard a lot about how these abusive practices do go on, and so we went in to fix that. And it's something a lot of people saw as a hill too steep to climb, maybe an impossible task. And Aimee had suggested in the fall that we really need to put some more emphasis on this and see if we can fix this problem and not just nibble around the edges. And so that's what we did with the help from ALPS, David Bell and Brad Denting and their crew in Missoula. And these were some really tough challenges to take on, but I want to emphasize we didn't do it alone. Aimee, is very involved with the chamber, but also in her role as a lobbyist for some of her clients, was a very active advocate on these bills. I mentioned David Bell with ALPS Insurance in Missoula, and David's involved with the American Property Casualty Insurance Association. And so he and Aimee together worked that angle, and he had hired Mark Baker and his firm to help us out. And of course, we had Steve and the BKBH team, and Sheridan and I and you. And it was, these bills were a big team effort to go in there and really push through some stuff that had strong resistance. But I think it's going to make a big difference and help moderate those really steeply climbing insurance rates. We see in Montana that our homeowners and automobile insurance is higher than all of our surrounding states. And we think we addressed some major causes of that in this session.
Great. And I think, individually, each one of those bills makes a difference. Cumulatively, I think there's like a big cumulative impact on this that we'll see in the coming years. And so aside from those sort of, Aimee.
I was just going to say, so after the session, so I really love seeing all the names out there that are listening and hopefully participating back and forth with us today. But I have to say that I work at the largest law firm in the state, and I received a call afterwards from one of our litigators who's litigated for decades. And he said to me, did you know about, and he listed off several of these bills. And I was like, oh, I was actually working on a couple of them. And I said, yeah. And he said, I have cases right now in trial mode that we will use these bills on, and they will absolutely help Montana companies in their defense of that product liability claim, or, this third party litigation issue, or common law bad faith, which is like pixie dust, right? Like this made up thing, right? And so I just think for the folks that are watching this now or in the future, I hate to say contact your lawyer, but they really will have an impact on litigation going forward. And it was really great to hear that from people who practice and work on Montana companies' behalf. Because I think sometimes we bring bills at the legislature and you wonder, like, is this going to do anything? And to hear right away from some of my partners was kind of exciting, to be honest with you. And then I addressed it with one of our defense groups at the firm. So I just wanted to add a little color to let you know there's an actual impact being seen right now.
Well, and thanks for doing that, Aimee, because I think that's part of the complicating factor that we had during this session is that these package of bills that we brought forward they're complicated. They have a tendency to be attorney-centric. Attorneys pay attention to them. The average business person doesn't really know what they mean. And so being able to explain them and celebrate their wins and be able to correlate to how that improves the business climate is a challenge. And so that was really helpful.
Well, and I think, Brian Wood, who was on the Montana Chamber Board forever, has a manufacturing facility in Laurel, came and testified on one of those bills and explained that his company is drug into court for people using in product liability cases, his product in a way that they shouldn't be. And, he's very, sad that something happened to those folks, but then his company is brought in. And so, I want to do a shout out that the chamber did a great job of also bringing in companies that are directly impacted. And I think that made a difference. And our bill sponsors, I think, were really terrific. And, you know, Steve Fitzpatrick and Barry Usher kind of led that charge along with Greg Hertz. So I just it'd probably be good to recognize those folks.
Yeah, great. Well, aside from our package of bills that we brought forward, we introduced and found sponsors for, there were a number of other bills that we got involved with, both on the proponent side and on the opponent side. And there were some bills that came along that we thought was worth us supporting and will have also a substantive impact on the business climate in Montana. So let's take that one first, and then let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the other sort of threats that we addressed that we were able to snuff out that could have had a negative impact on Montana. Steve, do you want to take a whack at some of the legislation maybe that we supported that you think will be helpful outside of our core package of bills?
Yeah, I think some of them that are going to continue on and will probably be at the forefront now, with the one that immediately comes to mind, and it became kind of towards the end of the session, was House Bill 971, and that has to do with the lawsuit that was filed against Northwestern Energy's power plant in Laurel and related to the Montana Environmental Policy Act. And that lawsuit overturned or vacated that permit. And so there was a flurry of activity to kind of try to figure out how to address that court decision based upon the kind of the widespread impact of what that court case would be. And the reason I say that one is going to be probably continued to be in the press is because the held trial, and I call it the held case because that's the Children's Health Trust, and I'm kind of misnaming the case, but it's the climate case that is going to go to trial here June 12th here in Helena. House Bill 971 is directly at issue in that case now. And Judge Seeley has already taken notice of that bill and is going to have that bill and MEPA as a core part of that trial. And so that trial starts, DEQ's involved, the Attorney General's office is involved, and it is centers around the right to a clean and healthful environment. And that case is going to have even more widespread impacts for a whole host of businesses and all kinds of business and economic activity in Montana. So that was one that came late. We worked, closely with the Department of Environmental Quality and a lot of natural resource industries to try to do something to minimize the impact of that case. And so that one, it was passed quickly and went into effect quickly. So now we'll see how that kind of plays out. And then you had the companion bill to that, Senate Bill 557. That was another one that I think it gets at the core of kind of not necessarily tort reform, but also the natural resource litigation components of trying to get at that ability to use courts to stop businesses in the natural resource and egg kind of industries. So those ones are going, and I think those things are going to continue to play out as long as you have the people who want to stop and development and things like that. So those things, the chamber stepped up and got engaged quickly and with the whole broad coalition of folks. But those ones, the chamber reacted quickly and built coalition and are successful in trying to do something. Hopefully it'll move the needle a little bit, but it's going to be probably things that can get us till 2 more years to next legislative till we can have more time to figure the right thing. So,
Aimee.
So one other one I wanted to add to Steve's is the governor in his proposal had the business equipment tax. So changing that level from 300,000 up to $1 million. And so that's something that I think was front and center for the governor's agenda. He had a kind of a variety of tax bills, and that was in that. And that's something that the Montana Chamber of Businesses have always supported. It's kind of this goofy tax, I think most people think, a business equipment tax. But what about for the manufacturers that are bigger, that make really big investments? And so as Steve kind of talked about for this sector that interacts with NEPA and with developing reliability and predictability for energy, what about the manufacturing sector? And so there was a bill that also passed and was signed by the governor, Senate Bill 530, that is kind of viewed as the super plus to the business equipment tax. And so if you're a manufacturer in Montana, right now you have, under this new law, you can go straight to knowing that on your new investment in manufacturing, as it's defined under Montana law, you have an 80% abatement for the first 5 years. And then on year 6, you have that rate of taxation that goes in at depreciated value. And depending on your work with the county commissioners, you have up to 100%. And that really puts us more on par with our neighbors in Wyoming and Idaho. I see some bankers out there watching this. And so when you're thinking about those manufacturers and where can they invest, I was just speaking with a colleague of mine that lobbies in Idaho, and they have been ahead of us, able to pitch better in Idaho, Wyoming. And I just think that we really need to support our small business equipment, raising that, but this is kind of that continuum. And I think that really is something also to celebrate.
So we did have some challenging bills that came forward that I think that anyone would argue that would have been bad for business in Montana, right? And we've got some great successes on ways we've moved the ball down the field in support of business, but there were also some pretty significant threats to business. And Aimee, you want to take the first crack at some of the stuff there that you worked with us on that was helpful?
Sure. Well, I'll start and let Charles intercede. He was more of the level hand sometimes. For anyone that knows me, that can't be shocking. So I would just say, I can see you laughing, Don. So Senate Bill 361 in particular, I think is one that you had on the list to discuss. I think well-intended by the bill sponsor, John Fuller, was concerned that firearms and as defined under that law, that it would prohibit discrimination. But the way that the bill was drafted, I've worked for the Montana Bankers Association for a number of years. It was just really untenable. And so we asked the Montana Chamber to come in, and really appreciate Charles and the whole team to really work on that. I want to thank the legislators who, took a hard vote, because sometimes when you say the word firearm, there's just this real kind of concern against voting against any bill that has that word in it. But what it really would have said is that any lender out there, the credit union or a bank, has to lend to a firearm manufacturer, producer, anywhere in that distribution chain. And that would be like saying, gosh, if you're in the dairy business, you have to lend to any dairy, entity in that. And so it doesn't really make sense to single out one industry. And so that was a bill that we spent quite a bit of time on, right, Charles?
Yeah.
So, and it did die, but it took quite a bit of energy. And I think Charles did a great job of collaborating and working on that. So Charles, anything else?
Well, one thing I'd add is that, the voices from back home, I think, made a big difference. And so when local banks and credit unions, when bank managers and, market presidents were calling their members of the Judiciary Committee and saying, this is unworkable. Here's all the problems this will cause. Especially, I think there were calls coming from, different legislators, local bank president, who handles the accounts, and saying, look, we've sat across the table from each other for 30 years and you've always trusted my advice. And let me tell you, this is a problem. And so, and we really recognize at the chamber, I think, the need for the business community to be really engaged at the grassroots local level with their elected officials. And so, which we're rolling out an organizational effort. In fact, we kicked it off a few weeks ago, encouraging folks to sign up and get more involved. And this was a great example. I think that ultimately led Senator Fuller to, back away from his bill. And it really gave a lot of other members the confidence to vote no on something where, When you read the first few lines of the bill, you would have thought, well, they have to vote yes because it's, firearms protection. But our argument was that the chamber represents tens of thousands of firearms owners and their employees who own guns across the state. And but this bill didn't work. And,
Right.
Yeah.
I guess, this would be a plug. I always think if you get the platform and have the opportunity to speak together like we are today and to a great group of people that are watching, I think we all need to have an action item. And I would just say the action item that was learned from us once again is that if every one of you on this Zoom reached out while you're watching this and texted or emailed one legislator and said, I work at such and such. Thank you for serving. This is important to me. It would help a long way because I think we're all really good at what we do, but as good as we are, we're nowhere close to the bankers that called and emailed those legislators on that bill, which is what you were saying.
Yeah. That's what changed votes.
Yeah.
Really.
So, and that's a good example of the role too that the Montana Chamber plays as a sword and a shield on behalf of business. And also an example, like there are times when we need to hear from individual businesses on some of these bills. So let's take a quick look into the next session, right? And like I said, it's not too early to be thinking about what 2025 is going to look like. And let's talk about what we see as opportunities for 2025 and what maybe some of the threats that we could see come into 2025. And then what interlays with this is the fact that we are redistricting our legislative districts. And so the legislative makeup is going to look different in 2025, not only because of term limits, but also because of the districts that these legislators represent are going to look different. And so let's kind of start with, like, what are the opportunities? What were the things that were left undone in this session that may also be threats going into 2025? Steve?
Well, I think there's no question that you're not going to have super majorities because of redistricting. I think you're going to see, if you look at the new maps and apply that, unless something kind of really strange happens, you're still going to have Republican majorities, but it's going to be a lot closer. Everything I've seen and people pontificating seem to indicate that you're still going to have a decent majority in the House for the Republicans, but a much closer one in the Senate. And so that's going to change the discussion. You're not probably, although with all the line item vetoes, you're looking at an ever increasing ending fund balance. I think with everything that had passed, it was looking to be about 500 million. That's continuing to go up. If the economy, depending on how tax collections go, they could have, who knows, significant amount of money to surplus next time. But if things go bad, maybe they'll use that money for purposes of the budget. So you don't know what'll happen there. But I think property taxes are going to continue to be something, even though the legislature's kind of hamstrung on what they can really do. We know that there's already one proposed property tax ballot initiative that could be problematic for the business community for a whole host of reasons, that is being going through the process right now. And so I think property taxes is going to continue to be an issue, and things like that. You're gonna probably see, as those margins in the legislature kind of constrict a little bit, some of the gains that are on this list, you're going to see people introduce bills to undo them because they didn't like them. We saw some of that this last session, even with the supermajority. You saw bills to undo things that had been done in previous sessions, even though they knew they didn't have the votes, just because they wanted to get votes on record. Going to continue to see that. And I think you're going to continue to see stuff like that. You're going to continue to see workers' compensation issues. Every session you see bills related to that. Whether it's the state fund, seemingly there's always bills with respect to how it's regulated, but also bills related to benefits and things like that are always seemingly being brought. And those are ones that the chamber and others always have to engage in to make sure that those, the work comp system remains kind of in a fair place for businesses so their premiums don't get out of whack. But I think if you're looking big picture, those are some of the things that are going to be continue to be the issue. And if things go really south and the state needs money, then taxes and cuts will be back on the horizon.
Aimee?
The only other thing I would add to that is from the healthcare bucket. There was a huge amount of discussion about mental health funding this session. And there were a number of bills that passed that fund mental health in different ways. I think we'll have to see how that rolls out this next 2 years and what do you need going forward. The other kind of unspoken elephant in the room is Medicaid expansion. Will sunset if it's not renewed in the 2025 legislative session. And the financial impacts of that on state budget are undeniable. So, there's a process ongoing right now where folks need to sign back up again. And we'll see how many of those folks are done and doing that by the 2025 session as that rolls on. But our big funding goes to Medicate, incarcerate, and educate. It's been that way forever and will probably never change. So we have to be always thinking about those 3 buckets. And I'm not an expert on the incarcerate bucket at all. So I have no idea if there will be some funding challenges or issues with that. But, with marijuana becoming legal, I'm not sure if there will be less incarceration along that, but we're clearly seeing a lot of other drug impacts in the state. And what does that do to the Medicaid/incarcerate bucket?
Yeah, and I think there's probably 2 other kind of general issues too. There's the next step of the red tape relief kind of deal from the executive. And as I understand it, the next step is to actually kind of reach out more to the regulated community and get their ideas during this next interim. And so there might be another layer or level of red tape relief kind of coming from outside in to the government. And so that'll be some stuff that'll probably be an opportunity for the chamber and others to weigh in. The other thing is we know there's a whole host of litigation over legislation that's already passed, and there's more coming. And conceivably, within 2 years, you're going to have court decisions that will give some instruction on whether, if there is flaws in some of that, then you'll see legislation potentially to fix some of those flaws if there were flaws identified. If there wasn't, then there's not an issue, but you'll continue to see those attempts to kind of fine tune some of those things.
Kind of narrowing it down, Charles, what are you looking at for 2025, at least conceptually, from a legislative standpoint?
I think we will be working on some work comp issues, and there's a lot of talk about potential changes in the way the state fund is structured. And so we're going to be looking to our membership for advice on that and where they think the best outcome would be to help lead that discussion. Tax reform that centers around providing property tax relief while keeping a broad tax base is an important discussion. And we'll continue to work. There's more things we want to do in the tort reform space. Really important part of the chamber's strategic plan going forward is workforce readiness and just providing conditions that help more people come into the workforce. And we saw 2 bills this session that moved the needle a bit and maybe provide some template for the next session. And House Bill 819, the Montana Community Reinvestment Act, provides funding for that housing to be attainable for middle-class workforce to be able to get that first down payment. And also the fund is sort of self-replenishing, providing ongoing money. And so that we'll see how that works. And if it turns out to be successful, I think that's going to be an area where legislators would be interested in allocating more funds. And then the Best Beginning Scholarship Program in the childcare side was the income limits were increased. the threshold for eligibility. And I think we were going to be interested to see how that brings more people into the workforce, but also how can we, whether it's using that program as a model or other approaches, how can we help families get the childcare they need so that two parents can make the decision to enter the workforce full time and really help Montana companies serve Montanans, because we're hurting for workers in this state, and our unemployment level is very low. We've got hardworking people, and we need to make opportunities for more of them to have a childcare option so they can be even, more people can participate. So I think those are, looking ahead, those are some priorities. That's already a big list. And so
It's a big lift.
yeah.
And those are
Yeah.
big, heavy lifts, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you think tax reform, continued tort reform, childcare.
Yeah.
And there may be an opportunity in this housing thing, right? I mean, we continually hear from businesses that the two strongest headwinds that they have for the sustainability of their business today and for their growth going forward is affordable housing or attainable housing, however you want to label that, and childcare. I think one's a little easier to fix than the other.
Good luck.
So
They're both really hard.
they're really hard,
Yeah.
right? And I think we want to take a good look at both of them in the interim and see if there's a role that we can play. And it's early, we're not even 30 days after the session has ended. And so these priorities will evolve, and given the sense that we have of urgency, that by time is of the essence, is that we expect that priority list to grow between now and then. And so,
I should probably point out that some of the things that have been talked about today still are not on the governor's desk from this last session. So
Right.
you might want to.
we might have to revisit.
Well, or plead our case on this podcast or Zoom. Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's the other thing that I think hallmarks this session. I have never seen such a trickle of bills getting to the governor and or how that goes. Right?
Yeah. All right.
Nodding.
We will stop the recording at this point.